Good evening, everybody. I'm going to hand over to Rae Hicks momentarily, who's going to be our host for this evening. But my name is Ellis Woodman. I'm the director at the Architecture Foundation. And welcome to day 2 of the book week, where we're kind of talking through 10 recently published titles with their authors. And today we've got a double header really about London. We've just had a session earlier in the evening about the Alternative Guide to the London Boroughs, published by Open House and edited by Owen Hatherley. But we're absolutely thrilled. We're now going to hear from Patrick Keiller about the newly published book based on his masterpiece, the 1994 film London, first of the 3 amazing films. But I think London is, just checked, they're kind of number 32 on the Time Out's list of the 100 best British films ever. But I'm going to let Rae, kind of explain a bit more. I'm delighted that Rae Hicks, wonderful painter, a recent graduate from the Royal College of Art, and Keiller enthusiast, has agreed to host for this evening. Rae, over to you.
Hi everyone. Hi Patrick. Hi Alice.
Hello everyone. Hello Rae.
Hey. Well, yeah, it's as I said before, Patrick. It's been an absolute pleasure to meet you over this interview. I came across London, the film, in Goldsmiths when we were doing critical studies, and it was part of a module that included some things like Georges Perec and a sort of introduction to Flannerism, and the idea that you kind of work against, or you find yourself in opposition to a kind of the general tide of a city that you live in. I think for me and lots of other people, that was strongly resonant. So a lot of people responded to it very well at the time. I think the main point being was that the kind of working motivation for the character Robinson in the book was to identify the problem of London, which I think is I think that's the most sort of enduring part of the idea of the film, the problem of London, and how that is set out in the film had a lot of resonances. I guess I saw it in 2010. I had lots of resonances still from 1994 when it came out, and it still does. I watched it again today. I've seen it a lot of times, and I was struck by how many of them still are very much at the center of the discussion about the state of London. Ones that came up most prominently to me were the city under Conservative sort of governorship, and well, not governorship, but over Conservative Party reign, and the city as it is held together by a sort of controversially handled public transport system. So yeah, I before we sort of delve into the rest of the film, I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about your beginnings as a filmmaker, because I know you studied first architecture. Was that the Bartlett?
Yes. I was an architect after a fashion.
Right.
I left the Bartlett in '74 after a rather checkered student career, and abandoned my profession, I thought, temporarily in 1979. So I was 5 years on the loose,
Right.
I did register. I registered in '76.
By register, you mean?
Part 3. Oh, sorry. Yeah. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
There are 3 bits of conventional architectural training in this country. Part 1, which is usually a 3-year degree. Part 2, which is usually a 2-year diploma or something like that. In my case, because it was the Bartlett in the early 70s, it was a sort of fiddle where they had something called a field experience year, where you actually, like a placement, 2 placements, one with a contractor. I spent 6 months on a Seaford site in Moorgate, which was designed by, I've forgotten his name actually, it wasn't designed by Seaford himself, it was one of his lieutenants.
Right.
And it's still there, I think. It's on the corner of South Place. Number 1 Finsbury Pavement, it was called.
Right.
And that was very interesting because the contractor, there were only, well, I better hurry up a bit, but I think there were only 4 of us who were employed by the main contractor. Me, the general foreman, the site agent, 5, the T-boy, and the crane driver. Everyone else was labour only. It was amazing. And there were hardly any drawings because all the subcontractors knew what Seaford wanted and they'd done it before, and they just everything worked like clockwork. And the site agent was very ill with angina and couldn't actually go off the ground floor of the building. So it was very strange. And the other 6 months I was at the DLC, working on Thamesmead, the Greater London Council, the GLC, in the Thamesmead division, which was also very interesting because Thames was it was leaking at that point. And I had to go and I drew the leaks in some of the more awkward bits of Thamesmead. And then I went back to, it was the other way around. I was Thamesmead before the building site. And then I went back to the Bartlett and did a 1-year diploma. But I got ill, so I didn't actually finish it till 74.
Right.
And then I didn't really know what to do. I worked briefly. I got involved with something called the Society for Environmental Improvement, which was what subsequently became the parent of what is now the Centre for Alternative Technology. And it was set up by a man called Gerard Morgan Grenville and a few other people. And it was a very strange organization at this point because it had Alf Robens, the head of the Coal Board, on its list of patrons. And it was very, uncool, you might say. And they got this quarry, which is where the CAT is now. And I was I co-wrote a book for them with one of their only employee, who was a man called Steve from Colorado, who built a steam car. And they recruited me as a kind of architectural advisor, despite my inexperience and youth, because they couldn't find it. There wasn't really, they didn't know anyone else really. And I went out there about 3 times, and we parted company because Gerard had been offered a lot of corrugated asbestos cement sheet to re-roof some of the buildings in this quarry. And I kind of said, well, Gerard, it was Turner's asbestos. I said, you really shouldn't be taking stuff off Turner's asbestos. It's not really doesn't look good,
Was it already known as a material that you can't use?
Oh, well,
dangerous.
Yes, but Gerard, not being in the business, he didn't know that. So I said, well, you're not going to take. They weren't really taking any notice of me. And subsequently, when I went back to London, and the next person was a proper architect, and he kind of set them right, and it went from there really. And I went back to London. I got a job with Max Fordham, thinking that I would learn more about such matters if I worked for a building services engineer. and ended up working for Max on Alexander Road, which was again a real extraordinary education. I marvel that the building got built, because it was built by McInerney's, who I previously only ever encountered as the principal alternative to Murphy's when it came to digging holes in the road. And you couldn't imagine a more complicated building if you tried. So that was good. And then I left there. I ended up working for Solon Housing Association, which was a bit different to Alexander Road.
Yeah. In what way?
Well, because it wasn't a London borough with a kind of top of the range public housing program. It was largely converting not very pleasant Victorian houses in South London into not very pleasant flats.
Right.
And on a kind of would-be cooperative basis. But also, Solon had bought some land in Bromley, in Beckenham, in a rather posh part of Beckenham. Possibly ill-advisedly, they bought these sites and had asked Walter Siegel to design possibly self-built housing schemes to go on these sites in the rather posh part of Beckenham. And that's how I became Walter's client.
Okay.
Which was a great privilege.
Yes, I can imagine.
But it wasn't terribly successful, because the people in Beckenham weren't really having anything that came with GLC. We had GLC funding for these, well, we would have had GLC funding for these sites. There was all this talk about people keeping chickens under the houses, and the whole thing degenerated into the most horrendous planning appeal, which was terribly funny in one way, but actually incredibly frustrating in another. It was a kind of taste of Thatcherism in the raw.
Okay, yeah.
Bromley subsequently became notorious as the people who scuppered Ken Livingstone's fair policy. When Ken Livingstone was head of whatever he was of the GLC. Yeah. Leader of the GLC. He introduced this policy where it was called Fares Fair, and it cut all the public transport fares. London transport, not the railways. And Bromley took them to court because they didn't want to subsidise poor people's bus fares.
I see.
So it's so I was, by the end of the 1970s, I was a bit exhausted, to say the least.
So you had, it looks like you've had quite,
ended up going to art school.
Right. Okay.
Having asked, I applied for a job actually with Cedric Price. I had two options. One was get a job with Cedric. I can't be bothered with this housing association predicament anymore. It's too much. The other option was to go to the RCA, the Department of Environmental Media at the RCA. I applied to the Slade too, but they didn't want me. But environmental media, Cedric also, he was very kind, but he sort of said, I think we probably not quite what I've got in mind.
Yeah. Did you have anything in mind when you so you transitioned from architecture and you've started applying to art school? Did you have anything in mind that you wanted to work on? Was it already film that you were thinking of, or photography? Was it already? Or you...
For some years, I'd been collecting what I subsequently came to call found architecture. And I'd done this by well, it was a slide collection. It was a selection of 35mm transparencies. that's how I got in. I took my collection with accompanying paragraphs to
Right.
my interview. Or I know that was it was before the interview.
Yeah.
I sent it off to them. I sent them this 48 slides, I think it was, and with a caption for each one, because they needed.
And were these slides? Were they ones that were they? Sorry, you said they were found architecture. So had you come across these?
Well,
or,
most, I would think many, if not most, architects, certainly in those days.
yeah.
Especially, I was teaching a bit. You see, I was teaching from '74. So there was this thing where you go away in the summer and you take pictures of buildings that you like or something. And then you come back and inflict them on the students in October.
Okay.
And that's how it started, I think. But it also, after a while, and many, to begin with, these were often images of continental European modern architecture. You know, one would go to Berlin and you'd go and photograph Sharon buildings, or you go to Vienna and photograph the Werkbundsiedlung. And I had a lot of this stuff. But gradually it morphed, it changed from that to more eccentric, non-architect designed or not building.
Not celebrated.
Structures that one could reinterpret.
Yeah.
And some of them were the kind of things you see in the work of the Beckers, Bernd and Hiller Becker.
Yeah. Okay. So
the photography,
formerly industrial.
Yeah, that or and there was scaffolding. I photographed the deep shelters on the Northern Line. I think I had a complete set of deep shelters at one point. Although they're not easy to photograph. None of this stuff was particularly easy to photograph, and I wasn't in any way systematic. I mean, these were not, the photography was not of a high standard. They were snaps, really. But that's how I started. The necessity to explain the significance of these structures, if that was possible, to other people. That's how the text started. The text started.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
So I had the idea of making images with text, which is, I think, and making the images first, you see. And I think that's, but I also had the idea of voiceover. And I did, to begin with, I did think also of moving camera. So there was an initiative to make moving pictures, but it wasn't very successful because, to begin with, the department had a Bolex cine camera, and that's a 16mm cine camera.
Okay.
Hand clockwork, and the longest run on a Bolex is about 24 seconds, I think, or maybe 27 seconds, I can't remember.
Right.
4 frames. And if you stand in front of a building and expose, 27 seconds of 16mm film,
yeah,
not much happens. So there was the thing about, well, the buildings don't move, and I didn't move. I could have moved, but 27 seconds isn't very long. And architectural documentary seems to be a very unpromising field in film. There aren't very many.
What, still, you think?
I think permanently, yeah. I mean, there's an awful lot of architecture in cinema, but it's not very, it's usually because things are happening. There is some sort of action, and the architecture is where it happens. So you see a lot of architecture, but if you just try and make a film about architecture, it's not, doesn't usually get very far. I mean, I can't think
Yeah,
of very many good
I
films.
suppose there's.
There is
I
one.
suppose you need the angle of the
There's one.
poetic angle that you started to introduce.
There's one very good film, which is almost an architectural documentary, which is Alain René's Toute la mémoire du monde, which is a film about, it's a short film, an early René film, short film about the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, which,
Right.
because it's actually about a book, and it's kind of passage into and through the library, the process of accepting a book into the library.
I suppose the
and you move about the library, so it's a kind of motive.
The two films like that I suppose come to most people's minds. Well, probably one, if it's going to be architectural, is Last Year at Marienbad.
Yes, well,
that's probably the
same filmmaker. He's the same.
Is it? Okay, right.
Yeah, so Alain René.
Okay.
Yes, he's certainly.
Because I wanted to ask about your sort of stylistic and technical influences around the beginning of art school.
Anyway, the narration, the idea about narration came from Chris Marker. And I'd seen Chris Marker's La Jetée at a very impressive.
Yeah.
I saw it in 1969.
Mm.
When it, or possibly 68, when it was only 6 or 7 years old. I mean, it seemed quite old then, but it was incredible, you know, compared to now. It's what, 55 years old, that film.
Yeah.
More than that. Can't remember.
That was one we were shown actually, I think, at the same time as yours.
You probably would. And that
it's quite a curriculum film.
The possibility of what you could do with narration. Although I had no plan, I had absolutely no intention of making a film until 10 years later. It stayed with me in the back of my mind that that was the possibility. You could actually make a film out of still images.
Yeah.
And voice. Although of course I hadn't noticed when I thought this, that these still images were actually of people playing a narrative. I'd kind of failed to catch on that La Jetée, although it is made of still images and narration, there are people in the still images and they're actors.
Yes, of course. Yeah. As opposed to there's a fascinating part. There's a great part in I think towards the beginning of London where Robinson mentions that he wants to begin his own series of tourist postcards.
Postcards, yes.
Yeah. A lot of the shots in the film sort of they edge onto the territory of postcard in that way.
Yeah,
there's a lot of there's things which are not postcard friendly, but then there's other stuff like we saw in the previous photo. There's pageantry, and it's got an interesting crossover with. I don't know if you can still do it, but I remember I used to collect postcards from around sort of tourist souvenir shops in central London, and for some reason a lot of them were very old-fashioned, and I mean, obviously the stills, well, not really stills, but the angles in London have very much a kind of tonally, you can't help but sort of read a kind of tongue-in-cheek tone when there's filming the changing of the guard. But obviously postcards don't have that. But it's quite...
actually. They sometimes do. They sometimes do. I mean,
tends to be a bit more end of the pier, though.
I mean, one of the features of the images in the film, although possibly not these two, is the central perspective. And the central perspective always struck me as being funny. And you see that in postcards. So the way that postcards are framed often is quite funny. depends on the postcards. But I mean, I too had and still have a collection of postcards of London. Many of them are Piccadilly Circus, and many of them are produced by the John Hind Company, which was either called John Hind or Cardarama. These postcards were nearly always photographed in the 1960s from a high viewpoint overlooking Eros on the southwest side of Piccadilly Circus. I'm not sure where it was. By the time I was making the film, Piccadilly Circus had been cluttered up with an awful lot of things that weren't there when the John Hind photographers, who very often had Middle European names, I noticed. There was E. Nagel, or Negeli, I can't remember which, and somebody else, I've forgotten his name. But these people were obviously not English originally. And I was very intrigued by this because they were they were the kind of the only good postcards of London I ever found were from John Hind, apart from some black and white ones. There was a shop in Haverstock Hill in the 70s and 80s that sold a range of Gordon Fraser black and white postcards, many of which were by Edwin Smith. So they were kind of, I mean, he wasn't a postcard photographer. He was an exhibiting photographer, Smith. So Gordon Fraser, you know, was a bit arty. These were quality images, these postcards. Whereas John Hind ones were also quality images, but I don't think they had quite the same other life. But by the 90s, you know, postcards of London, contemporary postcards of London, I could never find anything that was worth buying, really.
Well, so I mean,
stop me from buying them, but you know, because you collect.
I suppose the ones I'm talking about that I partly collected, they weren't good shots. You know, they were. It was bad photography, but they had an interesting. When they're on this postcard tower, this revolving tower, you got this sort of funny narrative going on because some were good. And it does play a little bit like London because you have some which have you know, more sort of classically composed images alongside ones which have a sort of quite a ripe ridiculousness to them, and they kind of go along in this deadpan way, which is less intentional in the postcard thing, in the outside the shop, obviously less intentional as it is in the film. But that's it's interesting that you mentioned that because
sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say just because of the similarity to a kind of array of postcards, and that you also had an interest in that, and then that Robinson himself mentions postcards. But then you also mentioned this company, you said, with Central European photographers, and that echoes Robinson himself, doesn't it? Because
Ernst Ludwig was the other one. Ernst Ludwig and E.
Ernst Ludwig, and that was sorry, was that a photographer for a postcard?
These were people credited on the back of Cardarama and John Hind photographs.
Right. Okay. John Hind. That's
John Hind. I mean, Martin Parrs talked about. He's written about this a lot. I think because they also did a whole load of stuff for Butlins. There's a whole genre of Butlins postcards by John Hind Company.
Right. Okay. I have Martin Parrs. I think it's just called Bad Photographs book or something.
Boring postcards, isn't it?
Boring postcards, yeah. Sorry, yeah.
But no, to go. I mean, the thing about what you're saying about a lot of the postcards that one could buy in the 90s were actually photographs from long before. You still buy Cardarama cards in the 90s, but they weren't. They were 30 years. The images were 30 years old.
Yeah, so, well, that's what struck me about ones available when I was collecting postcards in about 2010. I still sort of do. You still get really old postcards, very weirdly.
Yeah. And they're often the ones you want because they've not got nasty borders on and they haven't got silly writing. And, you know, the postcard, postcards, very, I mean, there are some parts of the world now where you can't really buy postcards. It's a lost industry, I think, to some extent. There were also,
I can see that happening.
There were hand-tinted postcards too. I don't know, have you ever come across those? There used to be,
yes.
When I first came to London in the mid-60s, my brother-in-law, who worked for ACP in Soho Square, we used to get the bus to Gower Street and walk through Hanway Place, I think. And there were all these windows where you could look in the window and there were people hand tinting photographs with colour. And I don't know if it was postcards or whether it was just anyway, you know, I don't know. But I mean, going back to the thing about the postcards is that it's a symptom of London being a city which, certainly at the time I thought of making the film, seemed to me to lack a credible self-image, because all the postcards are of all this kind of flummery and rubbish, you know. If you compare
there's something deeply insecure about. There's something deeply insecure about a sort of hysteria of postcards, a gaggle of postcards.
But they were not, you know, the imagery that was associated with London was nothing to do with Londoners. To do with the monarchy and, you know, policemen's helmets and stuff.
That's interesting point.
So that was the motive, really, for making. That was one of the motives for making the film. That was that was part of the problem. The problem of London was that it didn't have that.
That's one of the first things. So I said at the beginning that it was a lot of people when they move to London and they let's say they finish university or they are, you know, there's usually a point where you come face to face with London, and that's when the problem of London becomes something you have to start untangling. And I think that was the first facet of that situation I noticed, was the issue of London's self-image and how much it was entirely at the service of the kind of highest bidder visually. It how is it able to monopolize its visual image, and who's going to pay the most for those postcards, who's the biggest group of tourists, that sort of thing.
I mean,
it seemed like there were various eras of London's past that were being kind of I remember this big shop opening on Piccadilly Circus called like it was called like Britpop or something a bit like that, but it was post any kind of movement, cultural movement, and it was very much for tourists, and that seemed symptomatic. That was basically a shop as a postcard. It seemed symptomatic of this sort of rummaging through the sort of filing cabinet of history to find things that are going to appeal amidst a sense of kind of lost appeal or lost identity.
Although, I mean, having said that about lacking a credible self-image, maybe that's not such a bad thing, despite the effect it has on the postcards. I didn't come across this, but I mean, there's a line at the end of the film where Paul says, he quotes Robinson, he quotes the unseen protagonist, and he says, the true identity of London is in its absence. In that it is truly modern, or something like that. And it's slightly ambiguous, it's not really clear whether the true identity of London is its absence or whether it's its absence of identity. And I think probably it's the latter. I think that's what he meant, in as much as I know what my fictional character means.
Yes, yeah.
I wasn't quite sure what that, how to kind of, no, people liked the line, people associated with the production of the film. So, oh, that's good. And so I thought, well, okay, I'll leave it in. It was only years afterwards that I came across, there's an essay by Adrian Rifkin called, who you might have encountered, probably, no, you probably didn't encounter at Goldsmith.
Not me specifically, no. But,
somewhere. When I think encountered him, he was at Middlesex University. But anyway, Adrian wrote an essay a long time ago now, which is titled something like Freud's Rome, Benjamin's Paris, Who's London?
okay.
And he ascribes London to Lacan, which about whom I know almost nothing, or if not Lacan, to Mrs. Wilberforce, the leading character in the Ealing comedy The Lady Killers. And so
Okay.
that's okay. I'll have that. But there is this thing about no one. It doesn't have what London, what Paris and Rome have. But on the other hand, I think Adrian goes on to feel that this is not necessarily a bad thing, in as much as I could tell from reading the essay, the article. He talks about the 253 bus route.
Yeah.
Very movingly. The 253 isn't quite what it used to be, but it's still an unusual bus route. It's one of those bus routes that isn't linear, of which there aren't as many perhaps as there used to be. But the 253, when I was a student at the Bartlett, I used to stand outside Warren Street Station. The 253 started, or if you like, ended at Warren Street, and it went, I think it went in a kind of arc through northeast London, as far north as Seven Sisters Road.
Okay.
And then came back to Aldgate. And you kind of think, well, why would anyone want to do that? You know, what's this bus route about? The 31 was a rather similar route, because it started, I think, at World's End in Chelsea, or possibly even in Battersea, I can't remember. And it ended up in Camden Town. And it was a circuit. It was a bit like the North London line, which was a kind of secret in the 60s and 70s. Not many people knew about the North London line. It went from Richmond. From Richmond, it used to go to Broad Street next to Liverpool.
Okay.
Station, but in later years, it went to North Woolwich, where the Woolwich Ferry goes. And now it's part of the so-called overground. What Ian?
Okay, right. Yeah.
Ginger line.
Yeah.
Does anybody call it the ginger line?
I've heard that.
I think it's a ginger on the map.
I've heard.
It's on the tube map. So because it's on the tube.
Yeah.
It wasn't on the map before. It must have been.
Yeah, of course.
Somewhere. Yeah. It wasn't part of TfL or anything called London Transport. It wasn't part of London Transport.
It's an interesting point then you raise about how a city deals with not having a very fixed, easily recognizable brand, because there are other places that it's sometimes just an element of the human condition. I think that your city or country happens to be in a kind of in-between state of moving from one identity to another, and that's a point of sensitivity, and all sorts of things can happen then, whether it's a kind of political drama, but also I think that's often a time when images can become extremely controversial, and they tend to image making habits tend to, I think, separate into a kind of an insecure desperation, find or reinforce an existing image, or remain open to what could emerge as a new possibility for a sort of hitherto unimagined image of a city. I suppose what the postcards we're talking about, they can run that variety depending on whether the photographers of the companies feel about the situation in a city. You know,
Well,
he gets.
Yeah,
Sorry, go on.
they're not, by postcard production, I don't think it's not that complicated, is it? But I mean, I think the question I would pose to anyone is whether that critique of London still applies, because you know, it may be that it was a delusion.
What was a delusion? Sorry, the idea of it having
this absence thing.
Okay.
I don't know. I mean, it might have changed. You see, the context for the film, anyway. The context. The year I started, I think the year before, we finally started photography for the film, cinematography for the film. Richard Rogers and Mark Fisher, the Labour MP, had produced a book. In fact, they produced a television series. They'd gone round sitting on the top of an open-top bus, pointing at things that were the problem. I can't remember what they pointed at. Then the year afterwards, I think in '92, this book was produced, which I can't remember the title of, but I never read it until recently. And it was part of, I mean, it's a fairly kind of full-on attempt to critique and perhaps to remedy the fact that London is not like European cities in the manner in which we've just been talking. Because that was my prompt was, you know, because you go away every summer to the mainland. And I would come back and stand in Trafalgar Square and get terribly depressed because it was full of, I don't know, maybe it's radioactive. It was full of granite, you know, and these rather unfortunate monuments. And of course, then traffic, because London, you know, Trafalgar Square now is not like it was in the 80s and 90s at all. And think. I mean, there were other places one didn't have to stand in Trafalgar Square, but that was the sort of epitome. In fact, before we started making the film, I was testing out a camera. Somebody got us an IMO, which is a clockwork 35mm camera, bought it in New York in a market somewhere. And I took it out on New Year's Eve, 1991, to Trafalgar Square. To witness the revels. And the revels consisted of not that many drunk people and an illuminated sign around the bottom of Nelson's column saying, "Please go home," which was...
Blimey.
I mean, we didn't use the footage because it was a bit of a mess, but the clockwork was on this camera was a bit worn out. Couldn't work out what speed it was supposed to go at. But that was, you know, that was not. Again, this is kind of the London not being something, and this was, in some respects, echoed by this project of Rogers and Fisher. They wanted to make London more like a civilized European cosmopolitan capital.
Okay.
And to some extent, even though the book, if you read it now, it's difficult not to smirk. But in some respects, that could be because they succeeded. You know? Because as soon as the film came out, almost before it was in the cinemas, there was a whole kind of Barcelonaization going on of London, and suddenly the pavements were covered in cafe furniture, and
really,
the kind of, you know, there was a kind of life that hadn't existed in the 80s.
So there's
And then before,
There's
you
a
know,
part.
then there was, you know, there was Tate Modern, which was a kind of
Yes, yeah.
London suddenly got equipped, and one can be skeptical about the motives for equipping London as a quasi-European capital with more, you know, more attractive and desirable cultural entities. And one can perhaps put it down to the need to make it possible for, you know, international bankers to enjoy themselves more. Non-English international bankers, that is, who didn't go shooting at the weekend necessarily. But it undoubtedly did change for the better in that respect. The downside is that where the real problem of London when I made the film wasn't that it didn't have any decent postcards, that it was an incredibly expensive place to live, and not very nice when you found somewhere. So, and that's like 1,000,000 times worse, you know. So, although that's not really mentioned very much in the film.
I mean, if we're talking about the problem of London, I think that particular point is one that is, I mean, you might have a different perspective on that. You may feel that that has improved a lot, but you can't really argue that no one could really argue that that's very much a sort of a sore point of London, is the price and quality of, and the livability when it comes of the city.
What, housing?
That's very much, yes, yeah. I mean, finding somewhere to live and it being rubbish,
it's
and then
just impossible. You know, I mean,
yeah.
It's much worse now than it was.
Okay, yeah.
And in you know, like in the 80s, in the 70s and 80s, maybe not so much in the 90s, but in the 70s and 80s, there were ways around it. There was Acme Housing Association. I mean, I think, does Acme Housing Association still exist?
The only, I don't think so, actually.
I mean, Acme, someone ought to write a book really about the way in which what used to be called short life housing made it possible for London's, well, there was Acme and there was also Space, of course, Space Studios. How that made certain things possible.
Acme Studios is still going, I'm pretty sure.
What are the implications of that not no longer being the case? As far as I can make out, an awful lot of what used to be called YBAs don't live in London.
No, I was thinking about that actually when we get to the you get to the point in the film when it's filming Arnold Circus.
Yes.
Which that's what made me think about that YBA movement, because I think they moved to that area in the late 90s, I believe. Around Hoxton and.
Well, yeah, I don't know. I would have thought before, but I mean, Hoxton.
Maybe it was before. Yeah.
Hoxton's quite interesting because Hoxton was a kind of, as far as I can remember, there were quite a lot of attempts to gentrify Hoxton that didn't.
Oh right, okay.
Didn't work.
It's often spoken of as being something completely overlooked until one particular point.
Yeah, but I mean, it wasn't. I can remember there was a bit of music business settlement in Hoxton in about in the late 70s, I think. But nothing really happened. It didn't work, you know, in the conventional gentrification.
Okay.
They had to try again, you know. I don't know who was responsible for these initiatives, if anyone, but it took a while. Whereas the Boundary Estate, I mean, was always, I would think, a desirable place to live for a certain sort of.
Really? Okay. That was one of the first, am I right in thinking that was one of the first slum clearance sort of replacement housing?
It was I think, the first LCC.
It says that in, yeah.
The first, well, the other one would be Millbank. I think the Boundary Estate was first. I'm not 100% certain, but the other one is
Sure.
behind Tate Britain is the Millbank Estate, which is similar in some respects. It's arts and crafts, arts and crafts.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Blocks of flats, I mean, I don't know what's happened to the Boundary Estate. But I would imagine, looking at it, and from some acquaintances in the past, friends in the past who lived there, that the Millbank Estate has been fairly heavily right to bought.
Okay. I had that impression of Boundary as well.
I don't know about Boundary.
I don't know, but possibly. Yeah. But so you had quite a background you ended up having quite a background in social housing and the idea
briefly,
of
briefly,
because that is Robinson's one of his anxieties about the re-election of the Conservatives is the impact that's going to have on the type of place he lives.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
And what was the because again that's another issue that was repeating now. What was the sort of whoops, sorry. Right. What was the worry for someone in his position? He briefly mentions that the rent would go up and the quality would go down.
Yes, and there would be more deprivation in the neighbourhood. Yeah, as indeed there was. And I mean, the film ends with the fitting of metal roller shutters to the shops in the street, which was a response to kids, teenage crime, which is not. I mean, you can't directly attribute that to John.
Right. Yeah.
It's not coincidental. John Major, now as the hero of the film in some respects, given his recent utterances, but and he is certainly the star, if there is one on screen. He's the on-screen star of the. I mean, I can't believe that. I nearly messed that up. The Downing Street sequence because I had a fear of getting scaffolding. The press were arrayed on scaffolding, kind of bleachers opposite the front.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
And I knew that if I went to the back, I'd get a scaffold pole in my picture. And I can't have that. And then the production manager, Jackie, turned up. Jackie Timberlake, who now runs Guardian Films and has done for years. She turned up at about 6 in and said, "What are you doing down there? You should be at the back." So he saved the day, and I hurriedly moved to the back of the top of the top row at the back, and put it all in. So that was very fortuitous, and he's really the only actor, probably. The only performer, put it that way, in the film that I can think of, apart from the strange man in the bowler hat, who was apparently a feature of Speaker's Corner at the time.
Oh, okay. I know the part you mean now.
And I mean the kind of political aspect of the narration is a kind of given, really. It's not. I mean, I didn't set out to say those things necessarily. I was much more interested in whether I could actually make any images, and whether they would be images that did what images I hoped would do, which was a kind of transformation. Oh dear.
What's happened?
I got a horrible message about Adobe Flash Player.
Okay.
Probably some sort of malware trying to get in. But anyway, it's gone now. Sorry, where was I going with that? Yes,
it's political aspect of the Robinson situation.
Trying what the images were supposed to do, which was to
transformation,
to somehow subjectively transform the place in a surrealist manner, because the whole business of this found architecture and trying to photograph found architecture, trying to make photographs of places, spaces and places, was to do with what Aragon writes in Le Paysan de Paris. It was an attempt to respond in some way to the surrealist frisson. And although, I'm not sure that, the pictures in London, they're not exactly hallucinogenic in the way that one might want them to be. But there was something that it was very unusual when the film was released, and it possibly still is, although less so, to see the spaces of one's own life represented in 35mm cinema. And I attributed the relative success of the film. It's not like it was for that kind of film. It was much.
It's a cult hit
than anyone expected, and it played in the West End. I think for about 3 months, not every day. By the end, it wasn't every day, but it hung around in the cinemas, possibly because of tourists. I don't know. It was. I don't think it was ever on more than one screen, but it was there. And I attributed the fact that this had happened to the shock value for Londoners and possibly also visitors to London in seeing their own space on the cinema screen.
Okay, yeah.
In a sort of relatively credible film.
Yes, yeah, relatable way. Yeah,
that's quite unusual.
Yeah, no, I can. It's and as you, it still sort of is actually. I think, and seeing it. Yeah.
People. Somebody once said to me, I say people, only one person actually said to me, "Oh, I liked your film. It made me like London again." And I thought, "Oh, well,
okay." I think the character of Robinson, I think that might have something to do with that. I think there was a lot of sort of inconspicuous Robinsons who were not weren't in the picture of the city until then. So I wanted to ask about how. So if that was kind of if that was one of the sort of main, not reasons, but one of the main facets, ended up being one of the main facets of the film, how then the book came about, because it's it's the same thing in an extremely different
the book came about because Damon and Stephen at Fuel asked me if I'd like to do it, with encouragement from somebody called Rebecca Warren, whom I'm very grateful. I had was very keen to do it, because the narration has never been published before, and had been frequently misquoted, which is not really very important. But there was quite a funny bit where there's a line in the film where he says Robinson believed that if he looked at the surface of the city hard enough, he could force it to something like he could force it to reveal to him the molecular basis of historical events, and in this way he hoped to see into the future. Now, Channel 4, Film 4, had made a web, because they used to show the film occasionally, they made a web page for it, and they misheard the word historical as his own sorrowful events, which is very revealing about television. Television obviously is not interested in ideas, it's interested in emotions. So they couldn't handle historical events, but they could handle his own sorrowful events. So there was a bit of that. I wanted to publish, reference, but also because the film had recently been scanned, because all the prints had worn out, and the British Film Institute, whose film it is, had made a new digital high definition scan.
That's the one that's available now, right?
Yeah,
it looks amazing. Yeah,
watch that on their player. And they'd made this, and so I reasoned that it would be relatively easy to get hold of high definition images for publication, whereas before there was a very limited range of publicity stills which were made from print trims in 1993, and mostly been lost or duplicated, so they didn't look very nice and got dust on or something. So there was a whole new possibility visually. And I'd previously always pursued, pursued alternative modes of using the material. The next book, Robinson in Space, had been a book in 1999, a sequel.
Right.
And the third one,
Ruins.
Robinson in Ruins, had been I turned it into an exhibition with a lot of help from some very nice people. And also that had a book. So there were these other ways of looking at the thing. And it seemed to me that's something that, because I rather than wanting to be, I think none of this would have happened if there hadn't been the films. But it seemed to me that it's interesting to look at the material in another way, and you gain something, or you lose something. Because the book you can't hear Mr. Schofield, Paul's wonderful.
Yeah, which is brilliant. Yeah,
you can look at it in a different. You can read it not a linear way. For a start, you can look through it quickly, or you can go back, you can turn the pages, and you can study, should you wish to do so, you can study the pictures if they're worth looking at for longer than they're in the film, or less, or shorter than the film. And some of them, it seemed to me, did repay scrutiny. I was quite surprised. That picture of Spitalfields, which was
yes, yeah,
with the church at the end of the market. I'd never really looked at it properly since I photographed it, because it cuts very quickly to a close-up in the film. I'd never noticed the man who looks a bit like somebody, Courbet or somebody. I don't know. Does he look like Courbet? On the right, he doesn't really look like Courbet. He looks like somebody out of Courbet. He's amazing.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so that was another reason for doing it, because it meant one could
of course,
excavate a bit,
totally. Yeah, I suppose it also returns to an earlier format of yours as well, because that's presumably how you started.
Well, people
during
talk
your
about
time at art school.
People talk about the films being the images in the films being still images, and of course they're not still images at all, because there are lots of people walking about, and even when there's nobody walking about,
they have a real quality that makes me want to describe them as still images, though, because I think it goes back to that thing you said about John Major being the only performer. There was never really a central performer.
No, that's true.
But this with just a still photo, or with just a postcard, perhaps, you don't have a sense of this kind of disenfranchised watcher who Robinson is.
But there are quite a lot of
but when you have,
there are quite a lot of crap.
Sorry,
there are quite a lot of crap here and there,
Yeah, and they're always quite minute, almost.
What there isn't is real sound. in the film,
Okay.
because the film was all photographed silent, and all the sound in the film is post-synchronized. So the sound is quite artificial, and I think that probably makes a difference. Because
I'm not sure how tangible the artificiality is. One of the effects I think it has is of the whoever's viewpoint we're looking through is not really listening to the main event. Like there's a lot of bird sound and kind of these background sort of city noises. There's a sort of tuned out.
There's a bit, there's a bit. But I mean, in that respect, it's entirely fictional. Although no more fictional than I think most films.
No, of course.
Most films, you know, maybe the dialogue is live, but the background sound is often largely post-synchronized. You know, footsteps.
Yes, of course.
We had Foley artists doing the footsteps, there's some sound. There's some sound in it from Blow Up, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there's
right.
some wind, which Larry Sider, who is the editor and sound designer, went to this sound library and picked out some sound, which turned out to have been recorded for Blow Up.
That's something that the two films share, actually, is that that sort of sense of emptiness and stillness, whilst they're not technically empty or still. Like you said, there are crowds and there are people in it, but they're so sort of minimized.
Yeah.
This idea of a kind of the watcher being at a remove is something that both of those films share.
Yeah.
All right, that's interesting. I didn't know that.
I should acknowledge the contribution of the designers, because the way they've done it. I mean, I couldn't have.
I know it's lovely. Yeah.
The better, really. I'm very pleased with the way it's come out as a book, and I hope you are.
I love it. I didn't know what to expect. I wondered how that could work, really.
I didn't either. I didn't.
Film becoming a book. So I wanted to talk a little bit about perhaps this, if we've got time. I don't know how we're doing for that, but this. We've briefly touched on it earlier, but Robinson being potentially an outsider to London, we don't really know. We don't know much of his background from the film.
No.
But there are hints of it when he's in the supermarket, talking about sort of looking at the imported goods and having a quite an emotional, nostalgic reaction to them.
Yeah.
Because of their promise of elsewhere.
Yes. Yes. Well, I didn't finish.
I'm not sure what my question is there, but it's
anyway, the resolution of these two known facts about him is that his parents came from Europe after the Second World War with their new name of Robinson, and set up this nursery with the giant vegetables.
Okay. This was for anyone that's watching. This was a conversation that happened just before.
Yeah, this is stated in the second film, Robinson in Space, which turns up, which towards the end of the film, Robinson and his companion end up in Blackpool. And there's a picture of there are a lot of glass houses on the outskirts in the Fylde region of Lancashire, outside Blackpool, and this was an opportunity to make this allegation about his parents. And also hopefully to evoke Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
Right.
Which I don't know whether anybody. And the letter M, because it's opposite a Morrison's. The letter M looks a bit like Batman,
Okay.
and also stands for Martians. So, excuse me. So there was all this kind of inferences, but in the other film, the third film, he's supposed to come from Berlin. So I think probably what happened is that at a young age, relatively young age, he ran away back to Europe because he was arguably born in Europe, but came to the UK as a baby. So he has no memories of Europe. And he goes back to Europe and travels around and settles in Berlin until in 1966, at the age of 21, perhaps, he arrives in London and subsequently becomes a part-time hourly paid visiting lecturer at the University of Barking, which is a fictional creation, not unconnected with East London or Middlesex Polytechnic.
Right, okay. I was wondering if that was just something that had closed since then.
I used to work. So that's just about possible, isn't it? And has sort of it's a kind of attempt to ingratiate myself with a sadly late resident of East Anglia in some way.
Okay, sorry, how do you mean?
Well, I'm obviously sort of, if I were to peddle this version of his history,
okay,
it might seem a little Sibaldian, you know.
Right.
It's a kind of cheap imitation of some of the characters, or something of the characters of the late esteemed writer. Just so another one, you know, another one trying to do something out of poor Max, who is now no with us, who I never met, not that I've ever expected to, would have expected to, which is a bit odd actually, because you think, well, okay, if he's really, if that's all true, why is he so worried about, why is he so worked up about England? You know, what's the problem? Because England is much more of a problem if you're English, I would have thought, than if you're from elsewhere. I haven't quite sorted that out yet.
Well, I suppose London is often seen as separate to England, and so many people.
That's a very good point. I mean, when I made the film, and you'll see this in the book, perhaps more clearly, the problem of London is certainly, to some extent, that it's English. Even though it wasn't, even then, it was very unlike the rest of England.
Yes.
Unlike other English cities, almost as much as it was unlike continental European cities, and certainly unlike Scottish cities. But you know, the whole kind of City of London flummery and the monarchy and all that, it's all to do with, that's part of the problem of England. And part of the problem of London also. But now, London is much more unlike the rest of England, as we've seen recently.
Do you think it's, in doing that, it's become, has it become more similar to certain other cities in Europe? Has that been one of its reasons to move away from, one of the ways it's moved away from the rest of the country?
I wouldn't know that, but certainly I don't think I wouldn't be able to. I wouldn't really know that because mainly because I haven't really been abroad for a long time. But I don't think it is. I mean, it's been equipped as I said before,
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
a lot of things that you might think are more like European city. But it's still, I mean, the structure, you know, the spatial structure hasn't changed very much. I mean, there are kind of new bits, but most of it's pretty much as it was in the 90s, I would think. So in that respect, no, but politically and culturally and economically, it's very unlike, you know, England. Many parts, I think there are. I mean, it's unlike the southeast, and it's unlike the north, and it's unlike the southwest. So there's whereas, so the critique that the problem of London is partly that it's English is maybe not. It's changed, you know, because London is certainly much more Europhile now.
Yes, it is. But it was. I remember having a very similar reaction. Like I keep saying to Robinson's kind of wish for elsewhere when he's looking at the foreign foods in the London supermarket, because as an artist, I remember thinking that it had such a sharply different profile to other major cities in Europe, and that's quite different now. That's really changed in the last 10 years.
Yes,
but only 10 years ago, this I was wishing for my own version of you described this sort of Barcelonification of the place. And I think that's a lot to do with London attracting people and sort of who then subsequently become quite dependent on it. It sort of seems to suck in people from all over the world, which the rest of the country doesn't quite do.
No.
And then once you're in Robinson's position, once you've got something resembling a foothold, you're quite dependent in lots of ways on it, because perhaps perhaps there's also maybe an opportunity that you can't find elsewhere. It's a kind of uneasy give and take.
Yes. I mean, although the other thing is that in the early 90s, the city was still rather on the back foot.
Right. Okay.
Why was that? City.
Yeah.
You know, because the Big Bang happened in 1986, but was followed fairly quickly by a recession.
Right.
And the big US investment banks, I don't think had arrived in 92. And there was a real worry, I think. I mean, I probably exaggerated it in the film, but there's this thing about maybe everybody will piss off to Frankfurt or something.
Yes, I remember that point. I remember that being
people that was mentioned, you know. And spectacularly didn't happen.
Right.
You know, the city of London has not gone the way of the docks.
No.
As Robinson predicted it might, which was a steal actually from Malcolm McLaren, I think, was the first person to start talking about that.
Right. Okay.
There was this idea, you know, that because the port had vanished, well, actually hadn't vanished, it just moved downriver a bit and been split up. London was still the biggest port.
Right.
Probably still is, I think, in the UK.
Yeah.
It's just that the port of London goes from Teddington to Foulness. So
okay.
It's not just because it's not in the Isle of Dogs anymore. It doesn't mean to say it's gone away. But so there was an idea that the square mile would be up for grabs. Be all night, you know.
That was echoed again in a couple of instances more recently. That was something I hadn't remembered from my first viewing of London, but when I watched it again recently, that was one that stood out and surprised me, because that's been echoed again in not only the Brexit, the idea that oh, is everyone going to move abroad, and is London no longer going to be attractive to certain people?
Yeah.
That has come up for that reason. It also came up a lot in this sort of debate about public versus private and taxation versus sort of kind of versus sort of conservative ideas of not taxing big business. And there's this idea of course, of if you raise tax, all the business will leave the country. That was one view.
Yeah.
And then that's been a really, really recent, I think, discussion that's come up a lot, which I was quite surprised to see already there in this 1994 portrait of the city.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I don't know. I mean, we'll have to see.
yeah, absolutely. Once again, yeah.
But,
I wondered if it was time to do something of a Q&A now.
if that's possible, yeah.
For sure.
I don't know, Ellis.
Are you all right, Ellis?
Yeah, but we should wrap up quite soon.
Yes.
But we do have a few questions.
You want your dinner?
I'm going to just pitch you them from the chat box. Jill McKnight asks, did you write the text for London before, after, or at the same time as the visual elements?
Oh no, after. Always after. There's almost nothing in the film that wasn't written after the cinematography was undertaken, and indeed the film was fine cut. There are two passages actually in the film which were in the pre-existing, the document that enabled the BFI to commission it. I had to produce something, otherwise they couldn't have decided whether to make the film or not. And there were kind of bits of sample narration in it. And the two bits of sample narration were the kind of literary curse which opens the film, the bit that starts "Dirty Old Blighty," and the other bit is over some flotsam in the Thames, and is introduced with the caption "Utopia," which is a sort of romantic idea about hunter-gatherer economies. They were written before the film was photographed, but that's all what I can remember.
And then we've got one from Philip Christou, mutual friend.
Hi, Phil.
Patrick, at the beginning of the discussion, you mentioned your early days in architecture and your entry into the RCA with 35mm slides. You've not mentioned what happened between that time and London, i.e. your short films.
That's right, yes. Well, after the first rather disappointing escapade with the Clockwork Bolex, which produced this kind of very grainy black and white 16mm 2 minutes of sort of ruined factory somewhere in Battersea, I think. I can't remember where it was. I was a little disheartened because I was completely shocked. I thought there was something wrong with the camera. I thought, how can you, this image is so awful. There's nothing, it's just dots. All you can see is the grain of the film. What am I going to do? Because I was used to 35mm still slides, transparencies, and 35mm is about 10 times the size of a 16mm film frame, but also because they were slides, they were the camera originals. There's no printing, so it's like that's the retina, whereas the 16mm black and white was, I think actually it was reversal, so it wasn't that bad. But even when it was reversal, it was just very impoverished visually, I thought. So then I tried portable video, which was then kind of just about feasible, but was kind of worse. And when I say worse, the definition was worse, and the look of it was sort of all kind of watery and fluid. But in the end, I found a way of engaging with the possibilities of 16mm monochrome film, and made a film before I'd finished at the RCA, which was 20 minutes long and consisted of 2 walking camera sections, one of which was 2 takes cut together so you wouldn't notice, and the other of which was a single take of about 10 minutes with a fictional narration about a robbery, but the before and after of a robbery. And then I got a little bit of money to make a kind of sequel to that, which is called Norwood, photographed in Norwood, with a certain amount of walking camera. And then I made another, well, yes, I made a film. The best of these short films is called The End. It used to be online, but I don't think it is anymore. It used to be online with the Lux, but I think they've taken it down. It was the document of a journey by car, although in fiction on foot, to Rome. And it's accompanied by narration read by the late Wladek Szebal, Polish actor, who was very well known as a character actor at the time. And it's a kind of slightly gothic-y travelogue. And that was subsequently shown on, I think the Channel 4 bought the rights, the TV rights, and showed it a couple of times. And there were 2 more similar films before I seemed to be eligible to make a longer film. So but by this time I was getting on a bit, so I was a bit embarrassed about these films because they are quite rudimentary, and had all through the 80s been trying to make kind of grown-up architectural documentaries. I tried to make a film about Adolf Loos when Wilfrid Wang, my tutor at the RCA was a man called Yehuda Safran, and Yehuda was then an artist, but somehow migrated miraculously and started teaching at the AA. And now he's still, I think, at Columbia. He went to New York. And Yehuda got involved with 9H, which was the precursor to the Architecture Foundation. And he and Wilfrid Wang, who was, I think, Wilfrid wasn't involved with the Architecture Foundation, was he? Do you know? I've forgotten.
He was director of 9H, yeah.
Yeah, he was. And Ricky went on to do the foundation. But anyway, Wilfrid and Yehuda they created this exhibition because 9H was very interested in Loos. This exhibition was to open at the Museum of Modern Art in Oxford in 1984, I think. No, maybe not. But anyway, I went, there was a lecture, Herman Czech gave a lecture. Stop me when you've had enough of this. Herman Czech gave a lecture at the Bartlett, and he showed these pictures of forgotten Loos buildings in Czechoslovakia, in what was then Czechoslovakia. And I sat there, I thought, wow, we really should go and see them. So my partner and I, Julie and I, we set off in our car, rather old car, and drove to the end of the Federal Republic of Germany and went down a sort of gap between the trees and came out at Mariánské Lázně, where we stayed the night, and then went on to Pilsen, which was where one of these buildings by Loos, it was a converted building in which Loos had made a flat for the manager of the Skoda works or something. It was opposite the Skoda works, which is this massive armaments factory. It was the biggest armaments factory in Europe before the First World War. And we stayed in the Hotel Skoda. We had the most extraordinary time for about a month. in Czechoslovakia. And the other building we were looking for was the sugar factory, which Czech had shown a picture of. And we did finally find we didn't really know where it was, but we asked around. We had a couple of contacts. We asked around. We went to the place where the sugar factory was, and we saw a sugar factory, but we were unable to locate any bits of it that looked as if they'd been designed by Adolf Loos. But we saw lots of other things. And then we went again later on. But anyway, so that was in '84. And on the way back, it was just, I think it was as Yehuda and Wilfred, maybe the exhibition was the next year, but it was in progress. And I tried to persuade the Arts Council to commission a film about Loos, because I thought, contrary to what Adolf Loos thought, I thought Adolf Loos's buildings would be quite well represented in film, mainly because of the round plan, if you know what I mean. You could look from one space into another, which was always the problem with interiors. I mean, I'm hopeless at interiors, but with Loos, you could kind of think of a way you might manage to do something. But the Arts Council were not at all interested in this. And so the next one of these projects was about the Czech Avant-Garde, having gone again in '86 as a sort of visiting scholar, and come back with lots of photographs, which were subsequently published in BD, Building Design. The third, and also unsuccessful, was about was a rather different project about Neolithic rock carvings, which I tried to persuade somebody to. So that all through the '80s, there was this kind of constant, unrealized arts documentary film going on. But all that actually emerged were these kind of so-called artists' films.
Well, I think.
Is there anywhere to see this, Patrick?
Which one? What, the unmade film?
Well, the pre-London.
Oh yeah,
BFI Online.
There's a DVD set actually. They're not distributed. They're distributed by the Lux, but I don't think there's retail. I don't think they have any. They have them as files, obviously, but I think they're just for screenings.
Okay.
But you can. They're on a DVD set. Rather expensive French DVD set, who insisted on my French distributor insisted on putting all the films I'd ever made on the DVD set, because
Patrick, we're at we're well past our bedtime.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
Sorry.
Fascinating. But before we go, could someone hold up the book to camera, please? Because I don't think we've seen it yet. So very handsome publication, which there's a 20% discount on offer from the AA bookshop for all of the titles in this book week. And if you head over to our website, it will give you the relevant code.